Hello everybody, welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello.
And we finally have a full expose as to the reality of the development of Anthem.
A massive one as well.
Yes, I can't say that I didn't see every single part of this coming to some degree.
For years you've been saying this, Scott, especially something we'll get to later on.
I think a lot of people have. I think that if you want to do the due diligence, you should go away and you should read Jason Schreier's full report on Kotaku, because he spoke to 19 developers from BioWare, or different key staff anyway, all anonymously, so they could share their stories as to just the brazen reality of developing that game. And the whole thing is just fascinating from top to bottom. So I don't really know where you want to start. Do you have any particular thing?
Well, I suppose maybe the fact that it wasn't even called Anthem until incredibly late in the game, or that no one had any idea what the Anthem was.
So initially, it started out called Beyond. It was going to be a survival game where the thing that sort of maintained across to the version that we have now is that you were still going out into a big open world, and you were still like trying to survive as long as possible, bring back different items to upgrade and things like that. But the focus was on surviving. The idea being that the world would change and modulate all the time. The devs would change like weather systems and stuff like that to see how long you could survive out in the open world, and if you could come back. The loot-based idea of it wasn't really implemented until later. But the biggest takeaway in regards to that as well is the EA's involvement. We can get to EA, but the idea for all this stuff all came from BioWare. The main thing that seemed to have screwed the game over was the complete lack of leadership after Casey Hudson left. And so,
What's really fascinating to me is that none of these games like this or Destiny that kind of had like tumultuous development processes didn't really start out as loot shooters.
No.
Like you just said, this started out as this kind of like survival game, and it was only gradually where that sort of online loot focus came into it. It was like that was the same with Destiny. At one point, that was supposed to be this kind of like big third-person like fantasy game, like story-driven, and then eventually that just adopted loot elements. And it's the same with this. It's like how does that just happen? Like you'd think that would be a very EA thing, like them coming in and going, look, this genre is popular, make us one of those, but it doesn't seem to have been the case at all.
Well, even like, because obviously the go-to thing is that you would assume that EA just said, make us a Destiny. And it's like, if you go back to when it started development, they had this idea for a survival thing, and Casey Hudson left and they appointed a 3-person senior creative leads team or whatever, that would sort of like, attempt to focus the game and go forward. But they didn't really know what they had. Like the thing that the report keeps reiterating is that years would go by where they would have meetings where they just couldn't really nail down exactly what it was. And Schreier points out that it's pretty much a tale of two studios. You had the BioWare Edmonton studio, which is the big guys, the guys that did the Mass Effect trilogy and those type guys. And I think BioWare Austin is the other one. The smaller sort of studio that helped out on Mass Effect 3, I think.
No, they were the guys who did Star Wars: The Old Republic.
Old Republic, yeah. So you sort of had these like two different directives, and so like they didn't necessarily know exactly what Anthem was supposed to be. In fact, the initial reveal, they didn't even know what the Anthem part of the story was. They settled on that afterwards. But one of the things that I want to touch on in terms of EA's involvement, because they do flag, bringing ideas up to the creative leads and not really just having things hand waved away in terms of the flight mechanics and the days were chopped and changed. But in terms of EA's involvement, we should talk about Frostbite.
Yes, we should, because just for years there have been reports that this is just the worst sort of engine to work with. If you're not making a multiplayer first-person shooter like DICE is, obviously they get the most out of it. They created the engine, but everyone else, every other EA studio has been forced to work with this engine. It just seems like it's been a nightmare. Like Jason Schreier mentions in the report that Visceral Games, formerly Visceral Games, and BioWare seem to have been hit the most because they're trying to create these like third-person like kind of like spectacles, the story-driven spectacles, but it just doesn't seem to be like a reality for that game, like those type of games.
So it's like someone's name who kept cropping up is Patrick Soderlund, who worked for DICE, and like apparently it was his mandate to get all of the games under the EA bracket to all be using Frostbite. But the Frostbite engine was developed for first-person shooters, for Battlefield, and that was one of the things that tanked Mass Effect Andromeda. You can go back and read the full expose as to the realities of how Andromeda went sideways. It was very much the same thing. In fact, on Twitter, Manvia Air, who was a developer back on Andromeda, just has been replying to this expose saying like, yeah, we experienced the exact same things. We're trying to use this game engine for a game that it clearly wasn't designed for, and in Anthem's case, sometimes they would want to implement stuff, they would want to address a bug fix or something, and they were waiting a whole day to see if they could actually affect it or not. They couldn't get their servers online, so they couldn't test the loot grind or the idea of playing with friends. They were testing online missions, group-based missions, offline solo. So it's like, and they knew that it wasn't going to work out, like, there's all that. So, and then all the I mean, there's just so much to it. Like, it's just that whole idea that so much mismanagement, such a lack of leadership, such an utter lack of focus. And even on the top side, the way that EA handle Frostbite is if you have a problem with the Frostbite engine, you get in touch with the Frostbite QA team.
Yeah, like the support team.
Yeah, there's like a support team, and it's like they reduced the devs down to just being like calling tech support.
Yeah, essentially. But then even that doesn't work because it says in the report, like, only the biggest games, your FIFAs, they would get the most amount of time from these guys because they make the most amount of money. So a team like BioWare, who, you know, make great games, but in like a single player sort of RPG isn't going to make the same amount as sort of this always online thingy. So they didn't get the support for Dragon Age, they didn't get the support for Mass Effect Andromeda, and it sounds like they didn't get the support here, which is so frustrating. And even BioWare staffers were brought over to FIFA because that development team switched to Frostbite in 2016, and they encountered the same problems of how the hell do I get this to work? And EA thought that was more of a priority, so we're like, we need the manpower on it to try and fix it.
What a really interesting bit is, so Patrick Soderlund, like, you know, he would go over at one point and would check out the general build of Anthem, and apparently he was initially, he just says that he was extremely disappointed and said, this isn't good enough.
Unacceptable.
Unacceptable. It needs to look a lot better. And so he was like, you know, he'd give them a few more months or whatever to sort of get a different build in order, and he would check back in later. But I think in between then, he flew out a whole bunch of devs to sort of like show them how the tech works and like different potential secrets as to how to get things working. Just essential stuff that should have been there from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I go back and forward on how much they're like, well, we'll let you, you know, artistic freedom, we'll let you do whatever. But then it seems like there were literal questions being asked that weren't being answered for years at a time.
Well, it's sort of like blame is kind of on both parts because EA has obviously mandated this Frostbite engine be used, but BioWare have had like 3 games to build it upon now.
Yeah.
Like, so they've experienced with it, and they've said how much of a pain it is the entire time, but they didn't want to take any of the assets from Andromeda's sort of like that their team's tinkering of the engine. They wanted to do everything from scratch because they didn't want to kind of associate with like the gameplay of that game. They wanted to make something new and something fresh, but that just sort of damaged them in the long run because they had to start from scratch once again and create everything. But that's 3 games in a row for that team that has just been plagued by issues from this engine.
We can leap into as well BioWare, because BioWare and /EA have responded to this. There's a statement on BioWare's website just says that they don't believe that articles like this, you know, they don't appreciate them teardowns of their individuals and stuff. But that's not what this article is. For me, one of the biggest takeaways is the addressing of stress and crunch, and you know, they literally refer to them as mental casualties or stress casualties of just, you know, you have these incredibly tight crunch times and these deadlines that EA wouldn't shift, and you're still trying to, you know, bring something together. And how the dev team would have to keep falling back on the idea of BioWare magic, of it working out in the end. But just the immense mental toll that took across years and years. And that's one of the best things that Schreier's trying to highlight is like going forward in the industry, these sorts of things need to be taken account of. And so I think that's the thing that's kind of unfolding is what does the industry change? Because we touched upon it with Rockstar's 100-hour work weeks.
That's it, like you just said, these stories.
Which were also a lie, by the way. That was also a thing that wasn't true. The 100-hour thing. That was a big old. That wasn't a thing.
But the crunch was still bad.
Yes,
the crunch was still very bad.
Point,
the idea is like we've heard these stories so many times before of like how just devastating this sort of working environment like is on your like mental health and your well-being and your like personal relationships and stuff, and nothing seems to be changing. And this has been the case in sort of BioWare, according to the reporting, where for like years now, and nothing has really changed because it's that idea of BioWare magic. Oh, it'll all come together at the last minute. We'll crunch towards the last minute and we'll get it there. And they kind of do, but that's not healthy. And it's like, no matter how many of these reports come out, nothing seems to change, especially when you get their official responses, which are just kind of like, video game development's hard. You know what I mean? Like, this is just how it is. It's like, no, you can't just wave it away like that. You've got to make actual change. And it must be so deflating for the people actually in BioWare who sort of see these stories get like told and like get out there, and then for the official response to just kind of shut it down and hand wave it away and not directly address the problems.
Yeah, which apparently is the thing. Again, it all has to go through anonymous sources and Schreier, but he was saying that the general sentiment at BioWare right now, in response to that statement, is just sort of general disappointment at the fact that it is kind of trying to be hand waved away again. And that sort of, you know, PR statement would have to go through like a mix of BioWare and EA. So you kind of can't really escape EA's control over the whole thing. But it is kind of illuminating and fascinating just how much the project going sideways was almost entirely, well, not entirely BioWare's doing, but a lot of it was BioWare too.
The one big issue I had with it was when Anthem came out, we were all complaining that it did not learn from the mistakes of Destiny, it did not learn from the mistakes politics of the Division 1. And by the sounds of it, like during development, like the guys in charge didn't want to even acknowledge the similarities between Destiny at all.
Yeah, literally,
like,
Destiny was a dirty word.
Yeah, Destiny was a dirty word. Apparently, everyone was sort of saying we should look towards what Destiny's doing because they're the market leader. We need to look at what they're doing right. We need to look at what they're doing wrong. But that just was off the table. It was like, no, we're making our own thing. Don't just stop making references to it. Like, as if when it came out, everyone else in the world would just be like, oh no, you're right. That's nothing like Destiny at all. Like, at least that's going to happen inevitably. So they should have used those. That was always going to come, so they should have just embraced it and been like, look, yeah, we have looked at the competition and we're trying to make it a better game. Yeah,
and it's like to roll that into the whole Soderlund time, the final time that they showed off their second build or the more refined build of the game to Patrick Soderlund, and sort of said that's when they finally got what it was.
Yeah.
But that was so late in development. I think that was 12 to 18 months before launch. It's just that they didn't really know, like, you read more about it, about how the Edmonton team and the Austin team just didn't really know what Anthem was supposed to be. It's like if you're working there, it's like, well, you can't talk about its potential contemporaries. You can't compare it to Destiny, even though it's the most obvious analog, because that's the thing they're trying to stay away from. But then all the initial survival routes aren't there at all because we're moving away from that stuff. They're picking and choosing different elements to bring on board on the creative lead side. The 3 team that stepped in for Casey Hudson to sort of like contest with Warframe and Destiny and whatever. It just seems like a complete mishmash of conversations not going anywhere.
Well, what they kept saying, everyone who worked on it seemed to just say like it was more or less made in 9 to 12 to potentially at most 18 months, considering the game was in production for 7 years. Most of that was pre-production, then everything was scrambled together at the last minute. Like, there's one really illuminating sort of tidbit that by the start of 2018, they had completed a single mission, which I think shows in the final project. Like, there was so much that they were just trying to get finished, and like it's sort of a miracle that any of it was as good as it was, because I do think that the core combat is like, it's great, but like the fact that it got finished at all seems to be the miracle here.
Well, even the flight mechanics, like they would take them out and put them back in. Apparently it's a thing at BioWare where when it comes to a Christmas break, the staff get to have a latest build of whatever game is in progress to play over Christmas and then come back with feedback and stuff. And the version of Anthem that they took home at Christmas, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, didn't have flight in it at all. It was just a base shooting sequence. And they went back and forward as to whether the flight thing was even going to be in there. But that now is one of the the only signature elements at all.
Well, that goes back to like the Patrick Soderlund thing. Like, he was disappointed with that build, so they wanted to put something in that would impress him, so they put flight back in because that was one of the mechanics they had finished, and then he loved it, so like then you just thought, well, we're definitely doing it, because apparently when they implemented it just to show him, they didn't know if it was going to stay. They were like, I don't know if this is going to work, we'll just put it in, and it's something we can show off, and then it became a core feature that was admittedly very good.
The flight is one of the only things that I sort of hold up and go, I genuinely love this. But I just think, it's just this complete, I mean, the word is obviously like cluster F as to the amount of stuff that was sort of planned and scrapped and redone, and the narrative was completely rebooted multiple times. The idea of the Anthem of Creation came after the first reveal and all that type of stuff. So I just think at the minute, obviously it's unfolding, but the first words around it just seem to be pretty much what we thought. But to a degree where BioWare's leadership side is potentially just as culpable as the idea that EA were this mastermind cartoon villain doing everything.
Which in hindsight, like the writing was always on the wall. We've had exposés like this on Dragon Age Inquisition, on Mass Effect Andromeda, and it's always been the case that the blame isn't just on EA, it's always been on like the studio like mismanagement and stuff like that, and the war between kind of BioWare Edmonton and BioWare Austin and all those other teams, like they just don't seem to be unified under one singular vision, which is obviously like damaged those games increasingly. A lot of people like Dragon Age Inquisition, but I mean like Edmonton, you can still see sort of like the cracks into that, and like that relied on the BioWare magic. A lot of people even said, sort of, who were talking to Jason Schreier, that they kind of hoped that game would have failed, because then it would have kicked them up the arse to change.
That's one of the biggest takeaways is how sad that is, that like they they got so bad in terms of the stress and stuff that they secretly kind of hoped that something going so wrong would at least be the catalyst for a wider conversation as to the way that employees are treated when they're under these umbrellas or companies and stuff, that at least it kickstarts the conversations that we're having right now, and it furthers the idea, like exploration of what crunch culture is and all that type of stuff in the development side. The whole thing is just kind of crazy. I totally recommend reading the report itself, and these are the most sort of the biggest takeaway points for now. But as it continues to unfold, we'll likely pick more of it apart. So let us know what you think down in the comments below. Did you play Anthem? What did you think of it beforehand, and what do you think of it now? For now though, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
Me, Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you soon.
Bye.
Bye.